Good morning, everyone. It appears that the flow of participants seems to have slowed to a trickle, so we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Wendy Sternberg. I'm the Vice President for Academic Affairs and Dean of the College here at Oxy. I'm happy to welcome you to the first Community Book Program event of 2022 with President Elam and Steph Cha, author of Your House Will Pay, this year's community book selection. The Community Book Program began in 2020 to bring our community together despite geographic separation. We aligned the Community Book Program with our summer read for incoming first-year students. The first-year summer read is always connected in some way to the mission of the college and its four cornerstones: excellence, equity, community, and service. By expanding the summer read to the entire community, the program brings together students, faculty, staff, alumni, parents, and other members of the broader Oxy community to experience the joy of reading and learning together. The Community Book Program Committee makes its selection through careful evaluation of community-nominated books in consultation with the core steering committee. The committee members strongly believe that Steph Cha's Your House Will Pay and the issues that it examines and raises serves the interest of our incoming class and other students this year. An award-winning novel published in 2019, Your House Will Pay is grounded in tragic real-life events that unfolded in Los Angeles in the 1990s, and in both the novel and in our daily experience are still very much with us. It is a fictionalization of the events surrounding the notorious killing of an African-American teenager, Latasha Harlins, by a Korean-American shop owner, Soon Ja-doo, a few weeks after the videotaped beating of Rodney King by several LAPD officers in 1991. Cha weaves a compelling story about the many ways this traumatic event affects both families involved in the Harlins-Doo tragedy, as well as the entire Black and Asian communities in Los Angeles, by depicting events in 1991 and in 2019. The Los Angeles Times, which awarded Your House Will Pay its Best Mystery Thriller Award in 2020, said, "As the action moves through SoCal's diverse and divided communities, grief, rage, repentance, duty to family, and more force readers to consider all sides of complex moral issues." Inviting a discussion of these complex moral issues is at the root of the educational experience we strive to provide our students at Oxy. And so the entire Oxy community has been invited to read this one book together. And today we all gather to meet the author and discuss its themes. Today's event will feature a short reading by Ms. Cha, followed by a 45-minute conversation between President Elam and the author. We received a number of questions in advance on the registration form, and we also invite audience members to submit questions using the Q&A feature on your screen during the talk. You're welcome to identify yourself with your name and affiliation or submit your question anonymously, and we'll do our best to get to as many questions as we can in the time allotted. Today's event is the first of several events planned around the book that will happen at Oxy this academic year. It is now my pleasure to welcome Occidental President Harry J. Elam, Jr. In July 2020, President Elam came to Occidental from Stanford, where he served as Vice Provost for undergraduate education for a decade. President Elam is also one of the foremost scholars of American theater generally, and African-American theater specifically, and has had an award-winning career as a professional theater director for more than 25 years. A graduate of Harvard, he earned his doctorate in the dramatic arts at UC Berkeley. He's been recognized professionally at Stanford for his many accomplishments with students, as well as receiving numerous accolades for his scholarship, including membership in the College of Fellows of the American Theater and the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. President Elam, I invite you to turn on your camera and get us started. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dean Sternberg. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to be talking with Steph Cha, I, like many of you, found the book hard to put down, and it was incredibly powerful read and beautifully written. So let me turn it over to Steph in a second after I tell you that she's the author of Your House Will Pay, winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the California Book Award, as well as the Juniper Song crime trilogy. She's a critic whose work has appeared in the New York Times, the LA Times, USA Today, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, where she served as a noir editor and is currently series editor of the Best American Mystery and Suspense Anthology. A native of the San Fernando Valley, she lives in Los Angeles with her family. Steph, turning it over to you, and thanks for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you all for reading my book, engaging with it. This is a real honor to be here. So thank you for having me. I'm gonna read just a very short section from the book before we start talking. This is from the actual the flashback of 1992. It lasted 6 days. 6 days of fire, a judgment poured over the earth. Figueroa Liquor Mart was gone, and Frank's Liquor, Florence Liquor and Grocery, Empire Market, and Jingle Bell Liquor too. Laundromats were destroyed, the machines jacked for coins, dry cleaners looted, plenty of people grabbing the chance to take somebody else's clothes. Some places put up signs like lamb's blood on their doors, black owned, they said, and they were passed over, sometimes. Terry's Interiors got the torch, and Rod Davis Firestone, and the African Refugee Center. After a while, fire didn't discriminate. They called in the National Guard. 63 people were dead. Sean watched it all happen. When the law didn't come, the lawless spread out. There were bangers everywhere, bold because the police were gone and because they had a truce for once. Their priorities shifted away from each other. When they started getting crews together to ride up into Koreatown, Sean went with them, riding in the backseat of Sparky's grandma's Ford Escort, not even bothering to lie to Aunt Sheila. Koreatown, it was where the Koreans were, Chung Ja-han's people, the people who believed and supported her, who thought Ava was Han's bad fortune, a thing that had happened to her, like a car crash or a storm. It made sense to him to take this outcry to Koreatown. They would bring this judgment to them, to her community, her family, to her. When it was over, everything had changed. Wherever he went, he saw the extent of the ruin, the cooled remnants of days of unchecked wrath. Where there had been buildings, there were now building frames, like children's pictures scribbled in pencil, gray and blurred and skeletal on the verge of disintegration. Roll-up doors defaced by graffiti and ash, the metal warped so they'd never close again. Rubble and trash littered the streets like fallen teeth, like dead skin, the rot of a ravaged body. The neighborhood looked like a war zone, a place like nowhere he'd ever seen outside of photographs. But he lived in it now, victim, civilian, soldier, insurgent. He was different, still changing, the core of him destabilized and reformed by the fire. He joined up with the Bering Cross Crips, Sparky vouching for him, saying he'd been through it, that he was stone cold for 14. Ray and Sparky and 4 other guys jumped him in at the parking lot of True Way Baptist the week after the uprising, the church's pink stucco walls charred black all the way up to the steeple. They formed a circle around him, each of them locking eyes on him and nodding, starting the ritual. Ray came at him first, and they swung at each other like they had a dozen times before, landing a punch each before the other boys moved in turn. He kept his fists up and gave them his best, and they knocked him down, each of them laying hands on him until he was on the ground. As he lay there taking hits, his muscles singing, the taste of blood in his throat, he gave himself over to the boys and the pain. How great it was, the controlled aggression of family, to know the hurt would never be more than he could stand.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Yeah, that section and a picture of Sean are really compelling, as is the image of the ground around and the city around. The city is often LA or Palmdale become characters within the story or the novel. Can you talk a little bit about that, what you wanted to convey? And we've got this story devastated that of in the aftermath that has taken down Korean businesses as well as African-American businesses, but leaves this community that looks like a war zone. So could you touch on that too as well, please?
Yeah, I mean, I'm from LA. I was like Grace and Miriam, actually. I was pretty young when the uprising happened. I was born in the mid 80s. But I grew up here, and I grew up in the Korean American community. When I started writing, I wanted to write about LA, and I wanted to write about Koreans in LA specifically because I felt like this was, it was kind of my whole world growing up, or a big part of it, and I never saw it depicted in any kind of fiction. And then when I found crime fiction, I discovered the way that these stories kind of showed you the places where they were set, in a way that was really effective and immediate. And so I wanted with this book, and with all the books I write, to tell stories that could only take place here. There's some specificity to the location that allows these particular dynamics to flourish. And I, of course, was very interested in the early 90s because I think, the early 90s and kind of the reverberations into present day, because, Asian Americans were typically not in the spotlight politically. We're a small minority of this country, and so usually kind of the racial politics, when we talk about them, don't divide in a way that kind of excludes us, which is mostly okay, but or it has its own problems, but but the early 90s in LA, that was a time when Korean Americans specifically were kind of at the forefront of this conversation, because of the Rodney King uprising and because of Latasha Harlins. And so I wanted to write about this place then and now, and then when I was looking at, where would these characters be today, the answer is actually not in central LA. I think there has been a major outmigration of Black Los Angeles into the exurbs, places like Palmdale, Lancaster, places like the Inland Empire. And Koreans are also a little bit more scattered. And, I grew up in the San Fernando Valley, where there's a significant Korean American population that I hadn't really seen written about. And so, I kind of like to write about places I know, and so that made sense logically to set the Korean family in the Valley. I've spent a lot less time in Palmdale, but that was a place that was very interesting to me. It's this exurb, like 70 miles from LA, where a lot of the people who live there work in LA and they commute. It's a really long commute, and the kind of income bracket is really compressed in Palmdale, Lancaster. People live there because there's a lot of housing and it's pretty cheap. So there's also, and I didn't get into this as much as I wanted to, just because of who the characters are in the book, but there's a lot of racial tension in that area too, among kind of the white residents and the Black residents, all of whom kind of make the same amount of money, but there are, I think, if you go on message boards about kind of good neighborhoods and bad neighborhoods in Palmdale, you're going to run into some real resentment. Let's put it that way. So I wanted to kind of write about these places and bring them to life. I think that is that is kind of the job of a writer who is who's writing about kind of social issues, and I think crime in particular. And so that was always important to me, to kind of make sure that these narratives felt like they would rise out of this ground.
Yeah, and then not only out of the ground, out of these specific characters, and the characters are so real and interesting, and seem true as well. So, how was that in terms of the process of writing to create someone like a Sean, as well as Grace, as well as Yvonne? What was the challenge there for you, and how was much research involved in bringing this book out?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, the first characters that I had were Grace and Miriam. I had this idea for these two characters who find out this history, who kind of deal with this horrible history of their family in different ways. And it actually started as a short story for a collection of Asian pulp. And when I decided that I wanted to expand it into novel, I realized that I would have to write both the Korean American family and the Black family. And I knew that I would have to go into the POV of Sean and his family, which was not something that I necessarily wanted to do. It's not something that I took lightly. But I thought about it, and I kind of weighed my options, and I thought, if I write this novel and it's all from the point of view of Grace and Miriam and Yvonne, if it's kind of about this Korean family reckoning with their own guilt and their own history, and then I have this Black family as kind of these side characters, what I would do is I would end up flattening the Black family. I would end up writing a story where this is the power of fiction, is that you empathize with whoever if you're on someone's shoulder for 300 pages, you empathize with them, even as you recognize their flaws and foibles, you kind of end up absorbing their humanity. And the people who are over there, who you have a little more narrative distance from, they become just less lifelike. You don't care as much about them, even if they could be the most perfect people, the kindest, most wonderful people, but you just don't care because you're not spending that time with them. And so I wanted to make sure that I presented kind of an even portrait of these families, just in terms of the texture. I wanted it to feel like you knew Sean, like Grace. And that was a big challenge. Because I'd written 3 books from the point of view of a Korean American woman, and Grace is a Korean American woman, and I've been a young Korean American woman, and so that and her family dynamics, while they're different from mine, I knew so many Korean American families with kind of first generation, second generation dynamics going on, and and all that. All the places that they go and what they eat, all that came from, my life. And so I had a lot more, an easy time kind of writing them and figuring them out. Sean was a lot harder for me to kind of nail. I remember one of the best notes I got was actually early on. I spent probably 2.5 years writing the first third of this book. Wow. And then once I figured out Sean and his family and the way that all was going to sound for the rest of the book, the second and third thirds, because I kind of wrote them in those 3 parts, came together pretty well. But while I was struggling with that first third, I remember my husband read a draft and he said, Grace feels like someone you know, and Sean feels like someone you read about. And so I had to kind of even those out to the point where, I don't know how it comes off in the page, writers are always the worst judges of their work, but I feel like I know Sean as well as I know Grace now,
I feel like that for sure.
Yeah, thank you. And so that was a lot of the work, was just kind of getting to the point where they felt equally full as human characters. Obviously they're fictional, but where, they had that kind of bounce back of fully imagined people. And the way that I got to Sean was, really through his family. And you know what, I think that's the way that I end up kind of approaching all of my characters, is thinking about what they care about, who they care about, and that kind of informs the way that they act and what's important to them. And so, Sean really kind of started snapping into place as I developed his relationships with his cousin Ray and with his Aunt Sheila, and with the kids, all giving him these ways to kind of be anchored in the world. Those helped me figure out who he was.
Yeah. And he wants to do the right thing for his family. And you mentioned writing crime novels and thrillers, and what you've done with the Song trilogy. This was somewhat different in that the focus is on also not just on the crime, but on the families and the dynamic. One of the things you see that happens in family novels, or family dramas for that matter, is that how the sins of the fathers or mothers are reaped upon the children afterwards. And there's that dynamic, but there's also commentary on what it means to be both a family as well as what it means to be a mother, and how can we understand Yvonne as a mother, even as she's done this horrific thing. Also Sean as a father and a surrogate father, for Ray as he's been for a while. So could you touch on dynamic of family and what you saw in terms of structuring these very different families, but have some values in terms of being a family that they share?
Yeah, I think people are always recognizable to us when we can see, they really care about their children, they really care about their parents. And in some ways, that is the bare minimum we can expect of people. There are some terrible, terrible people who love their children. And yet, when you go into their homes and watch how they love their children, it's hard not to be moved. I remember there's this George Saunders story about like this guy who's like a full-on Nazi and the way he cares for his disabled child, and it's like so uncomfortable and so horrible. But you can't not feel for him, even as the horrible things he does. And I think that this is what I was talking about, I guess, in terms of empathy, is like if you spend enough time with people, you see them at home, you're gonna find something that connects them to you in some way. You can say, I think my friend Todd Goldberg, who writes a Hitman series, really good, said this: if you can show somebody like loving their children, you're going to sympathize with them because you love your children, right? Or you love your mother, you love your sisters, you love your brothers, and so you find that point of connection with them. You can't help it. It's part of the reading experience. And I think that there's this instinct on the part of a lot of writers, because I see this all the time on TV, and you sometimes see it in books, where if a character is racist, they're not just racist, they're also cheating on their spouses. They're also just horrible in all these other ways that like kind of really allows you to cut the cord between yourself and that villain. And I think that that's not how people actually are. It's a separate axis. It's obviously connected to other things. I think racism is really, it intersects with misogyny and, all these things that will affect other parts of your lives. But I do think it's absolutely true that you can hate other people and love the people who are close to you. And I think that to pretend otherwise just lets us off the hook, right? It allows us to enjoy media without examining, the complexities in our own family, without looking at, the things that make us, that compromise us, right? Because the more you can put a villain over there, the less you have to think about, how you share anything with them, whether that be, personality or just community. And so when I wrote Yvonne, I wanted to write this character because, Sunja-du is unrepentant. The real murderer of LaToya Harlins. She has never shown any public remorse, and everything I've seen indicates that she thinks that she had, she got dealt a bad hand, and so I didn't want to redeem that character. That was not something that was on my agenda for this book. And Yvonne is unrepentant. But she's a good mother. And I think those things are not inconsistent. And I wanted to look at this conflict between, what you owe to somebody who has given you everything that they owe you, but has shorted everybody else. And I think that is kind of what Grace is dealing with, is the fact that Yvonne has performed all of her duties as her mother. She's been a great mother. And how does that affect what their relationship should be like? And I think there's no right answer to that. There are only wrong answers. The situation only engenders wrong answers. And so I wanted to kind of struggle with that.
Interesting. Yeah. Just touching on that just a little bit on the other side, one of the characters, the only character you write about in the introduction that you say was based on the real character other than Ava tangentially, right, is the aunt. And she's another surrogate mother figure, a loving figure, or she also is a figure that is shaped by this and has a different admission. So what about her, and what about that family that you can?
Yeah, Denise Harlins, who passed away in December 20, I think December 2019, or maybe December 2018. By the way, Latasha's real mother was murdered. This is something that I actually did not include in the
Really,
book
I didn't know that.
because I thought it was just too much. But she was actually killed by her former husband's girlfriend. It's like a horrible story. And so Latasha was, she was being raised in part with the help of her aunt, Denise Harlins, and her grandmother, Ruth Harlins. And when Latasha was murdered, they became very involved, especially Denise, in calling for justice. All these recall efforts of Judge Carlin, those were spearheaded by the family. They just did everything that they could to keep the story alive. And I found this very heartbreaking and inspiring in a way, but like they in many ways, they, systemically they failed. There was no justice carried out by the actual justice system, but they did succeed in keeping Latasha's memory very much alive. And they still and there are still kind of vigils for Latasha and memorials, and she has become a part of LA history, I think in large part due to their efforts. And so when I wrote about Aunt Sheila, I based kind of that drive on Denise Harlins. But this is another example of I don't think there is a correct approach when your loved one is murdered and justice is not served, right? I think that it's such a terrible thing to be placed on your shoulders that there's no correct way to respond. So I think that there's this tension between Sean and Aunt Sheila about, well, what is the right thing to do for this girl that they loved? Is it right to, because there's that trade-off, right? If you subject them to the media, then you subject them to media scrutiny. You have to do a certain amount of myth making. You have to kind of present this image of a child that is going to resonate with the most people, because otherwise they sink. I think when I started writing this book, it was shortly after Michael Brown's murder in Ferguson. And we saw kind of the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement as we know it today. It's just perpetual news cycle where, these young Black kids were being murdered by police, and you kept seeing the grieving parent get on TV and talk about how their kid was a good student. And there's just something so tragic about that they have to do that. And you can understand the calculation that goes into that and also be appalled that it's necessary. And so this kind of perpetual conversation between Aunt Sheila and Sean kind of addresses that issue of private grief versus versus your desire to kind of use the public and use that public outrage to kind of obtain this kind of often intangible thing called justice. And I think that at times I think that they're too harsh on each other, but they're both correct and they're both wrong.
Yeah, no, and you get a little bit of that too in the scene that you read, where Sean has a sort of impotence of it and is struggling with what he saw and couldn't act on, and where he can act now. And as you talked about, him getting beat and really liking, in a sense, or feeling the blows that came to him in a different way that give him a different sort of peace in the death of Ava. Ava is an interesting figure within this. You don't paint her as a child prodigy. You don't paint her as someone, so that media story of her and what she represents is flawed, like all of us are flawed and human. What did you want to do with Ava? And Ava, who appears in the novel, not that much, but is always there at the same time.
Yeah, I think you know, and I think this is something that happens in media is when there's an angle, it gets exploited. And so I wanted to write this story where you know, there's the story about Ava, and then there's Ava herself, and there's a little bit of a gap in between these two entities, you know. And so just the fact that she won this piano competition this one time, you know, allows there to be this narrative of like, oh, she could have been anything, you know. And I think that people like to mourn the promise of a gifted child. And you know, maybe that was there, maybe it wasn't, right? And I think that the argument, my argument, Sean's argument is that it doesn't matter. She should be mourned either way, right? But it does give Aunt Sheila something to present to the media, you know, to present this kind of palatable story that will take off, because it's so hard for a story of a young victim to stand out. And but I did want to ground this in the fact that, you know, Sean doesn't care that she was good at piano sometimes, you know. That wasn't really the core of her character. It was something that she kind of did sometimes. And, you know, maybe she was kind of good, but it's not like she would have been, it's not like she would have been like performing with the LA Phil in 10 years, you know. I mean, I guess that's always a possibility, but she didn't have the resources, you know, the odds were stacked against her being anything more than, you know, somebody who is, you know, pretty good. You know, as it is against any young person who goes out into the world and tries to enter an extremely competitive world. And so I wanted to have it be that like there was this element of this kind of shining element in her that was very easy to that was very media friendly, but that ultimately should not define her, and yet sort of does. You know, and you know, and also I guess the other thing is I grew up playing piano, and you know, I would do these competitions and stuff like that, and a lot of Korean American kids grow up playing some kind of instrument, and yeah, I thought that was that point of commonality too, which I think Grace also interprets as kind of a superficial connection point between them, which is you know, kind of misguided and kind of insulting. But yeah, I wanted to give her that little bit of something that would allow for a media lift of her story.
Now you mentioned Grace and seeing that connection. Grace comes to see the family and comes face to face with Sean twice, actually. And I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about that first instance. As my wife and I read this book aloud to each other, and it was a great way to do it. And at that point, we're like, why is Grace going there? What is she doing? So could you talk a little bit about why you wanted to bring them together in that, and Grace saying that she wants to help, and Sean wanting nothing to do with her at that point? Why that at that point in the novel, this confrontation?
Yeah, well, there's two major reasons, I guess. One is just narrative shape, which is that I wanted to bring the two main characters together more than once. And then once I knew that I wanted that, the actual scene kind of made sense to me. I think that I don't know. I mean, as a non-Black person in the U.S. who pays attention to social justice, I think something that I see often is this kind of real premium that that non-Black allies place on Black forgiveness and on kind of being included on the ally friend side of the equation rather than the guilty side. And I see it happen all the time, you know, on social media, which is kind of this public marketplace of people behaving poorly. And just for Grace's character, you know, she's somebody who is very clumsy and pretty self-centered. And I think that the way that a lot of us deal with our legacies, whether that be, you know, just things in our family, or, you know, that kind of American burden of being from a place with a really tortured history, a very harmful, deadly history that has benefited us. You know, if you have an American passport, you kind of end up in this place where your life has sprouted from everything that came before, you know. In that way, I think like Grace's story isn't that specific to Korean American LA. I think that she is kind of clumsily dealing with a particularly American guilt. And so I wanted to see her kind of barrel through and do it in this way that that I see all the time, which is, how do I absolve myself? And when your goal is to absolve yourself, that's a selfish goal. You're not thinking about other people, the way that it affects them. And, you think you're doing this good thing by laying this burden on other people and by kind of confessing and cleansing yourself. And it might be very cathartic for you, but, it like a lot of the time, the right answer is just to like leave other people alone. And so I wanted to have this first scene between them be one where, for Sean and his family, this story is decades old. For her, it's, days old, weeks old. And of course, the first thing she does is she just kind of barrels through and says, help me. She's asking for their help. That's what she's doing. She's offering her remorse, which, that's not even the right thing to offer. What can she really offer? She didn't do anything. She's not offering her remorse. I mean, she thinks she's offering her remorse, but really what she's doing is she's trying to extract something from them. And so at that point in the book, for her character, that made a particular kind of cringy sense to me.
Yeah, and that sense of, as you said, that her selfishness shows there. But maybe as we look at her, she's come to a different point after her mom dies, and we get into the final scene. But before going there, I want to talk a little bit about one other character, and that's Ray, and his sacrifice for his son, in one sense, to plead and confess. But at this end, there seemed at the beginning the potential so much hope as he came home from incarceration and he saw him with his family, and that hope dissipated. Job, even Sean knew he wasn't going to keep the job. So a little bit about Ray and your thinking there and what he represented.
Yeah, Ray to me, he's one of my favorites. I think I just find him kind of interesting. I think the fact that when I started writing their family, I knew, okay, I'm gonna have Sean and Ray have spent time in gangs when they're young, which I think there are a lot of stories about Black men who join gangs and go to prison. And I went kind of back and forth on whether I wanted them to kind of their life stories to look a little bit different from that, since it is something that it is a story that you see. But I wanted to also make sure that I hammered on because I think that balance between, these two kids ended up in this life in large part because their loved one was murdered, and the murderer of the loved one spent not even a day in prison, and I think that that's something that that's a big part of this Injadu Latasha Harlan's story, is that a lot of harm was done, and the way that the justice system tilted, it completely let Sunjadu and her side of the family off the hook. And I was just thinking about what it means for a parent to go to prison and for a parent to avoid prison. And that's so those years are so important. I mean, we have like my sister-in-law and her ex spent some time in prison, and they have a kid, and I think just seeing the way that these, even like a year of not having your parent can be so disruptive.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was thinking about Ray as this person, who does this kind of time traveler thing. He spends 10 years away from his family. They see him, but only during visiting hours, and it's not the same as having a parent present. Whereas Grace and Miriam had their mother their whole childhoods. Even if they're paying the price now, in some way, they got away with having a intact family. And so Ray is somebody who spent all this time away. And, when you spend that long in prison, not only is it hard to get a job, it's hard to reintegrate. So, I read up a lot on people who come out of prison and the way that they are able to reintegrate into society and kind of the struggles that they face. And it's not always successful, right? And so Ray is somebody who he wants to connect with his kids, but doesn't know how. And his son wants to connect with him and also doesn't know how. And so instead they make a lot of bad decisions trying to prove themselves to each other. And all Ray can really do in the end is this large gesture, to try to kind of be a father to his kid in this way that is very dramatic, and very, it's very loving. But in some ways he couldn't do the easier stuff, the stuff that's supposed to be easier, which is the day-to-day of spending time and getting to know somebody. And so that's part of that family tragedy too. It's that they're robbed of this kind of closeness that just comes from, growing up together, which Grace and Miriam got.
Yeah. Do the characters, a writing question, as we talked about these different characters, do characters speak to you as you write or not?
Yeah, more the point of view characters. It's it's really when figuring out the voices of the people that I'm whose points of view I'm occupying, they're the ones who really speak to me, because I have to write in their voice. But all of the characters are people who I empathize with to varying degrees, and who I try to kind of inhabit the way that they think. But mostly, Sean and Grace are the ones that I know the best, the ones who I have the easiest time imagining off the page.
Let's talk about the last scene with Sean and Grace. That's the pace of that scene is wonderful, and you feel the energy and the uncertainty and all the chaos that's around them. One of the things that comes there and is the symmetry in the sections of the book is that there's a riot and anger and outburst for racial justice that frames each of the stories as the characters find themselves within it. And the one word that I kept coming back to was the fire. And I thought of Anna Devere Smith, the playwright who talks about the fires in the mirror, and this struggle back in New York, Crown Heights, or famously James Baldwin talking about the fire next time. So this image of fire, this image of confrontation and conflagration, I wanted you to speak a little bit about that and the characters in it trying to find some way to act, to make it make sense, to make it meaningful, to find some course of action. Steph, are you there? I think you froze.
Yeah, she appears to be frozen.
Well, this was my last question. So
there's some amount of if there's a fire in a forest, it'll help the regrowth, right? And I think there is some feeling that is ongoing that that some systems are so broken that it's hard to talk about reform. The idea of just burning it all to the ground, it becomes more and more appealing the more broken the more broken the system appears. And so that I think that is, when you talk about riots, fire is the image that kind of comes to mind. That's, I think there were, thousands of fires set during the 6 days of the 92 uprising. That's kind of the defining feature. It's like there was smoke everywhere in the sky. You could see it from LAX, I think 2,800 Korean-owned businesses were burned to the ground. And I think it's just that really elemental reaction, this idea of raising and forcing some kind of renewal just by getting rid of what was there. And I think there has been, I mean, like the 92 uprising was very destructive. So was the Watts Rebellion. And yet these are events that have changed the course of municipal history and that have forced reckonings that legal means have not. And so I think that's what ends up happening, is that if you push people to the point where it becomes very obvious to them that there is no way to navigate a stacked, broken system to kind of break what's happening, then people are going to look to other means. I mean, it's only natural, it's only rational. And so I wanted to kind of bookend the novel with these kind of pieces of unrest. That little Westwood riot actually did happen, and I only know about it because a friend of mine, he's a small press publisher in LA named Peter Woods, he participated in it as a 13-year-old. And he actually went to Lataj Harlan's high school too. He was very helpful in kind of helping me with some of the early research on this book. But that was not on the same scale as April 1992, but it was that kind of taste of like, oh, this is something that is in the air, something could happen. But that was like a real event, and I just found the timing of it uncanny. But I think that when you are, when you're little, you're playing with fire, when you screw over a lot of people over and over again. And so I wanted to kind of have that feeling, that tension to kind of be on both ends of the book, because I also think that the events of Your House Will Pay and the kind of 28 years that it encompasses, they're just a piece of this larger cycle of LA and national history, where there is this kind of there's this kind of thing where every once in a while you have to, the pressure builds and you have to pay the piper. Like something has to happen, because you can only get away with with hurting people for so long.
Yeah, and it's not just you it's your house that will pay. So that sense of ongoing. Steph, it's been great talking with you. I'm going to turn it over to Dean Sternberg and to the audience questions. But once again, thank you.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thanks, Harry. Thanks, Steph, for a really wonderful conversation that we all have the pleasure of listening in on. And so now I'm going to turn to the questions that have been submitted either in advance through the registration form or during our conversation today. And I'm actually going to start with two that are more comments, not questions. Because I think they reflect something interesting about our audience and how the work has really spoken to them. So I'll start with a comment that was put in by somebody that's on the webinar with us today, Molly Dwyer, as a guest. And Molly writes, "This isn't a question, rather a comment. My aunt, Pat Dwyer, was Sunja Du's probation officer and wrote the sentencing recommendation of 16 years prison time that was dismissed by the judge. This case had an impact on her. I think she would feel like Cha's description of Du's character drew out of some of the things that she saw in her interviews with Du. A lack of empathy and remorse for her actions, as you mentioned, keeping her enigmatic but suggesting a darkness that her family sensed. Thank you for this exploration of not only this event, but also the surrounding issues. It would have been a thought-provoking reading regardless, but this connection to my aunt took me back to remembering this part of her life. Thanks." And that's from Molly Dwyer.
Oh, wow.
Someone else, Alana Kwan, who right here from Oxy's very own library staff, also wanted to share about the book and how this conversation has brought up memories for her. I just wanted to share that I experienced those days as an 8-year-old in Panorama City. Among the many thought-provoking moments in the novel, your description of the uprising in the book felt so familiar. As I read, I wondered if you had been there too. Somehow you described it through my eyes as well, and it made me feel even more a part of the characters' lives. Thank you very much for that and for sharing your experience with us today. So I thought you might like to hear those two observations from our audience.
Oh, that was very nice. Thank you. About the that's really interesting about your aunt being the probation officer. You know, yeah, there aren't that many. Like Sunja didn't leave like a ton of breadcrumbs. It's not like she was super public facing, but the few things that, you know, have come out like really stuck with me, you know, the letters that she wrote to the judge. In one of them, she called Latasha Natasha, and she also expressed some oblique remorse saying, you know, I can't imagine what her mother is going through. So she didn't know her name or the fact that her mother was dead. And then there was that quote that I used in the as one of the epigraphs for the book, which is, you know, I never could I have imagined something like this happening to my family. You know, and it's just very revealing, just that that very self-centered, self-pitying point of view. And I just that is what I got from it, is that she just completely lacked any kind of remorse or perspective, you know, after having, you know, killed this child.
Right, right. You know, it's funny. I saw that comment come in before you noted this observation of lack of empathy among the you know, the murderer at the time. So really interesting how that squared with the observations of those that were closest to her at the time. Very interesting. All right, so we have questions. I do like to pose questions that have been submitted by students. So I'll start with a question that was submitted by Anna Byers. Can you elaborate, who wants you to elaborate on Grace's quote, "Heaven requires a hell"? She writes, I found this line and the implications very interesting, especially considering the motif of the church in the Jung family life. Let me say a little bit about that.
Yeah, you know, that quote comes from, I think that was when Yvonne died. And that is Grace at the hospital, just considering where her mother went. And yeah, I grew up in the church, and I'm still like vaguely religious. I don't actually believe in hell anymore, which is a self-serving version of the religion I grew up with. But I think this idea of you know, where we go is something that is so central to people who grew up Christian. And you know, actually, while I was writing this book, my cousin was shot and killed in Northridge. Actually, he was shot near CSUN. He was in the process of committing a crime. He and a friend went and stuck up a drug house and were shot. And I actually saw him before he died, because he lived for about a week. And so actually some of the stuff in the book where, you know, she's alive for a few weeks and they have this opportunity to kind of, you know, answer these questions and face each other. I think that is something that I got from my own family, which is that in our family, it was a good thing, because my cousin had been kind of estranged from his parents for a couple of years. You know, we cousins hadn't seen him for a while. You know, he wouldn't really come to family things. And I was able to visit him at the Northridge Hospital, which is where, you know, I actually initially, when I started writing this book, I had Yvonne airlifted to county in downtown LA. And I only realized that there was a trauma center in Northridge because of my cousin. And my cousin's family is very religious. My uncle is a minister, and during that week, you know, they got to spend time together, and then there was like a very, you know, it was very healing, and there was a lot of prayer, and so I think that when he died, you know, I think it was of some comfort to them. It was of some comfort to me that we all had this time. But then when he died, my uncle actually gave his he did the funeral service for his own son. It's one of the most difficult things, and also one of the most beautiful things that I've ever seen in person. But one of the things he talked about a lot was, you know, where he went, and that he had come in the end to Jesus, and I think he took some comfort in that. And he also took comfort in the fact that, he believes that life on earth is a blip compared to the eternity that comes after. And I think that is comforting when you think that your loved one is in heaven. And I think for Grace, she doesn't really believe that her mother should be in heaven. Her mother dies at this point where there are so many unanswered questions, where she has shown this staunch lack of remorse. And she thinks that, she doesn't want to think about eternal life, because if she thinks about her mother in heaven, she has to consider the possibility that her mother is in fact in hell. And she doesn't want to face that. And so in this section, you kind of see her losing whatever religion she had in addition to her mother, because she doesn't want to think about that. Her mom found so much comfort in the church. Their family found comfort in the church. That's where they had a lot of their community. But in the end, it's not helpful to Grace, because she thinks that her mother does not deserve eternal life.
Interesting. So Steph, you've talked about this several times actually in responding to the questions posed by President Elam, but just hearing you talk about this last question leads me, I want to ask this other question. And again, you've touched on some of this, but Vivian Coe, another student, is wondering how much of the specific of the Parks family dynamics did you draw from your personal experiences with your parents? So that element of the family dynamics. You speak a little bit to how your personal experiences helped create that story for you, or those characters.
My relationship with my parents is very different from what is depicted in the book. I write crime fiction, so I write kind of dysfunctional families. And my family is, I feel like we're dysfunctional in like the pretty ordinary ways. We get along very well. I saw them last night. I'm seeing them, and my kid is spending the night at their place tonight. And also, actually, my family is atypical because my parents both speak fluent English, and they came here when they were much younger than a lot of Korean Americans in their generation. And so I think they were just like much more rooted here, and they speak English to each other. And my dad has been in the country for over 50 years, and he's been for a very long time more comfortable speaking English than Korean. And so they're a little bit more 1.5-y than Grace's parents. And so that's different for me. But I also have, a lot of friends who have parents who don't speak great English. And, their conversations are more like, they'll speak English to their parents who will speak back in Korean. And so that's a dynamic I'm really familiar with. And I think also the thing that is very recognizable to the thing that kind of connects me to that family, and that I think a lot of people who are second generation can probably relate to, not just in Korean immigrant families, but like any immigrant families, is that your parents come here like for you, whether or not you exist yet or not. They come so that future generations of their family can grow up American and can grow up with the advantages of being American, and yet they come here without the benefits of like knowing the context of this country, and their lives are just like often just a lot harder than ours are, and then we use everything they give us and invest in us, and then we go off to school and then we judge them for being racist. And that's something that that's like a very common thing, right? I don't even think it's just like immigrant kids. It's like any kid, any kind of first in family to go to college, or where that's unusual. You'll go off and come back and you think you're better than your parents all of a sudden, and sometimes you are. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes you get educated, and that education takes hold in a way that that gives you a stronger understanding of the place you live, and maybe an empathy that your parents lack. And that's not something that you can completely disregard or dismiss, and you want to foster that in your parents. But I have a 2-year-old I have a 2-year-old son, and I'm about to have another baby in a month. And the idea of in 20 years, this kid is going to be like yelling at me about eating animals. It just like haunts me, right? And it's like, we
And he
give it
will.
to you. And so that dynamic, I think, was something that I was able to tap into pretty easily. I think it's a strain that I find in a lot of immigrant fiction, but that I find, it's very American, and it's something that it's almost just part of the background.
Great, thank you. So this is a question about how the work's been received, and there are sort of two related questions, both from, so one's from Melissa Weekland, who is an Oxy parent, and another from Carl Emge, who is an alum. And so Melissa's question has to do about, she's interested in how authors view their own work. So you've been getting feedback from readers and some distance from writing the book. So Melissa wants to know, what do you love and what might you have written differently? Carl wants to know how the book was received by the Black and Korean community. So maybe you can talk about your reaction to the book, as well as these different communities' reaction to the book.
While I'm writing a book, I am very critical of my own work, because there's still stuff that I can do to make it better. And then once I turn it in, once it's done and printed, it's done. I'm not dwelling on like what I could have done differently. I love the book. It's out there. I guess I'm not particularly motivated to find things that I would redo. I mean, I'm pretty happy with this one. I will say, like, sometimes I'll read my first book and be like, okay, I was kind of a different writer then. This one I feel less like that about. But also the response has been very positive. I think this book has resonated with people, and that's something that I'm very grateful for. And yeah, I think there's not that much that I can't think of anything specific that I would have done differently in this book. I think I spent a lot of time editing it and kind of examining it from different angles, testing it for weaknesses. And, there are just a lot of decisions that I made during the process of writing the book where, I had to kind of consider the pros and cons of like various decisions in the narrative. And so by the time the book came out, even actually by the time that I was showing it to friends and editors to read, I actually found that I had anticipated almost all of the possible criticisms and objections, and I was able to kind of talk about the book and defend it, even if every decision is not perfect, right? Like, I think there's no there's no way to write a whole novel and like please everyone on every point. I think there are always kind of these balances that you have to strike, but I was always aware of what I was doing. And so I haven't really kind of tortured myself by revisiting the book and thinking about what I did wrong. As for the way that it's been received, particularly by Black and Asian American readers, I think I have not heard from anybody who feels to me like this is like the representative of this community or that community, but I have had a lot of Black readers, and I've had a lot of Asian American readers, and I think neither of those groups is particularly monolithic, and I've had I would say like overwhelmingly favorable feedback from both groups, and some criticism, which I think kind of tracks with general readership. Not everybody is going to 5 stars this book on Goodreads, unfortunately. As much as an author would enjoy seeing that, but I found that in general, readers have been very positive and thoughtful in engaging with the work, and so yeah, I'm happy about that.
Great. So here's another question submitted anonymously by a student. It was actually a question I had too when I was reading it. And I appeared to have froze for a second. So looks like I'm back. Can you talk about the Blake character and his relationship with Miriam?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks, Steph.
He was just a fun character for me to write. I just had fun with him. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, Grace comes from, I mean, all my characters kind of come in some way from me. I think that's it's more obviously recognizable when the characters are Korean American women, but certainly, but I think that Grace is, you know, a version of myself that I've been, you know, somebody who, you know, I was thinking if I'd never left LA, if I'd never left the church, you know, if I'd kind of stayed more insular, how would I have ended up? Miriam is probably the closest person to an author stand-in in the book, which means that I kind of make fun of her, you know, because it's fun. And part of the way I make fun of her is by having Blake, you know, and I think and like I am a Asian American woman married to a white man, who is not like Blake, but you know, that's something that I wanted to bring in. I wanted to bring in the fact that you know, this is a character who's very committed to social justice, but you know, is not somebody who is without, you know, hypocrisies, and who, you know, who doesn't have kind of the buy-in and the stake that that Sean's family has in this unfolding story, right? You know, she has a little bit more distance from the event. She kind of has more choice in how she reacts to it. And so Blake is part of that, you know, just the fact that he is able to provide Miriam with financial independence, and that the fact that that financial independence is tied to his ability to kind of tell stories in a medium that has generally favored white men. And so that's kind of what he's there for, to show to show what Miriam's world kind of looks like. And then, you know, he was fun to write.
I kept thinking there was going to be some other shoe to drop, and Blake, there'd be something crazy that happened between Blake and Miriam. But it's funny though, hearing you, what you were trying to do with that character and having a little fun with it. I could see where that might come from. Okay, so Gretchen North, a faculty member, has asked a question that's not specifically about Your House Will Pay. So she writes, after reading Your House Will Pay, I went on to read your Juniper Song detective series, a very different group of books. I wonder whether these works arise from the same authorial place. That is, were your aims the same in writing these books, or did they come from different parts of your brain, is what Gretchen wants to know.
I will say, I don't think I could have written Your House Will Pay if I hadn't written those 3 books first. And so for those of you who are not familiar with my previous work, I wrote a trilogy of PI novels that started kind of as an homage to Raymond Chandler. And that came from really early days of my education. My freshman year of college, I took a class on American detective fiction, and we read The Big Sleep, and actually we also read Devil in a Blue Dress. You know, and that was kind of, I grew up in LA. I didn't read a lot of LA fiction. And so it was kind of this big revelation to me, you know, reading Raymond Chandler for the first time, reading about kind of streets I recognized, even though they were from, you know, 80 years ago. And so I started writing my first book, Follow Her Home, as a reaction to The Big Sleep. And because I thought, oh, it would be so cool to read a book that that takes that sort of Raymond Chandler lens on LA, but uses it to tell the story of, you know, the community that I grew up in, and that I know and that I find so interesting. And so I had that in my mind as a book that I would like to read. And then when I started thinking I'd like to try my hand at writing fiction, that's kind of what I went to. I thought, you know, I'll try writing that book. And so that was how I kind of backed my way into crime fiction, because Raymond Chandler is a crime writer. And then as I wrote that book, and as I started working on a sequel, you know, I just started recognizing the way that, you know, talking about crime really just lays a place bare. Because when somebody dies, you know, in a way that is preventable, and intentional, it tells you so much about the place that it happened and the people who are involved. You know, when there's a dead body, you just can't ignore everything that went into making that crime possible. And it's this way that is automatic. You can actually, I have actually found the most overtly political fiction that I read and enjoy tends to be crime fiction, because it's so natural for all this stuff to come up. You don't have to beat anyone over the head with it, because there's a dead body on the ground. You have to deal with it. You have to kind of talk about it. It's unnatural to talk about, a woman killed by her spouse and not talk about domestic violence, right? It's just right there. And so I recognize that capability in this genre. And then I was writing a book in that series that dealt heavily with ideas of legacy and inheritance. Kind of one of the stories involved it kind of responsibility, like this idea of like taking responsibility for like historical crime, particularly the Armenian genocide. That was one of the big themes of Dead Soon Enough. And so I was already thinking about these ideas of history and inheritance and legacy when I heard a radio interview with Professor Brenda Stevenson, who wrote this book, The Contested Murder of Latasha Harlins. And somehow, like, working on that book and hearing this interview and going in depth on the Latasha Harlins story kind of exploded into this book. And it's a pivot genre-wise in the sense that my first 3 books are, they have that whodunit element. They follow the traditional form of a PI novel. So you're going at it through the eyes of a detective. With Your House Will Pay, I knew that wouldn't really work. And I just, based on what I wanted, what interested me in this story was the feeling of guilt, complicity, and shame that I had on hearing this story, and thinking about Sunjadu, that feeling of connection and community that is kind of inescapable when you're part of a minority group. And in order to do that, I knew that I was more interested in the family members. And Grace and Sean are people who in one of my Juniper Song novels, the PI would talk to them for a scene. They'd be there for five pages, 10 pages. They'd give you background, they'd give you some color, and then they'd be gone as the detective moves on to other elements of the story. And so I knew that I couldn't really do that. And I have a detective character, I have a journalist character, either of whom could have been point of view protagonists in another kind of book. But I wanted to write this crime story from a different angle, just like really from on the ground, because that was what interested me, just looking at the way that that this crime, wrecked these people's lives, and just sticking with that.
Yeah, and obviously stuck with it throughout the entirety of this story, and that leads me. So this will be the last question. We want to, wanted to make sure that we got to questions from a variety of different angles. But so I want to conclude with this one question that really asks you really to reflect a bit. And so the question is submitted by Alec Ariano, who is also a faculty member. He says, one of the most compelling and tragic parts of the novel was how the Park sisters' attempts to connect to and initiate conversation with the Matthews family only end up making the situation worse. And Alec asks you to reflect on this aspect of the book, in part because it seems like it can be an opportunity for drawing broader lessons about navigating intergenerational and interracial traumas. And some of what you talked about in your answer to the last question, I think really touches on this, in terms of your motivation for this particular story and your own experience. So I wonder if you can reflect on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, and that's true. The way that these families, even after the initial event, even after the initial murder, they'd be better off if they never saw each other. They never interacted. I think that everybody in this book kind of behaves in a way that is messy and makes something worse for somebody at some point. And I think there's some there's something too in the idea that, like, you know, by me messing around in this story, like as an author who, you know, is dealing with kind of complicated, unresolved history, you know, I'm also putting my hand in there and, like, you know, mushing things around in a way that, you know, brings up discomfort, and that can cause harm, and that, you know, and these stories being you know, just so unresolved and so terrible, and, you know, thinking about like what my position is as the author, and you know, and you know, one of the first things that an author has to ask herself is like, should I write this story, right? And I think you know, that's something that I dealt with, and something I still think about, and that's something that you see in the Jules Searcy character, that kind of ambivalence about you know, about like what it means to like engage in these stories about other people, and like involving them. I was actually thinking about this too when there were all these stories about journalists going into Uvalde after the shooting, and like what their duty is there, how they're supposed to behave. They're all like knocking on the doors of these grieving families, you know, but also feeling this duty to get the story out there. You know, everything's a mess. Like everything is a huge mess. And I think in some ways that, you know, there is, it's cleaner to stay out of other people's business always. And, you know, I think there's a life lesson there. You know, if you don't have to like entangle yourself with other people, you know, in a way that could have unforeseen consequences, and and especially when it could hurt them, you just don't do it, right? But that's not how we operate. We're always in each other's business. We live together, we hurt each other, you know, and then we just have to deal with it. And so I think that's, I mean, if there's a lesson to be taken from this, if there's anything that I kind of really wanted to say, you know, with this book, you know, other than the fact that, like, you know, these constant intersections of the political and the personal, I guess it's that, you know, there's some kind of really clumsy dignity that you can find, and that you have to find, in just continuing to try and struggle, you know, while keeping other people in mind, while thinking about other people, you know, also just figuring out ways forward, you know, doing something, right? Kind of recognizing that a situation is untenable, recognizing that things are not right, and doing what you can. And then if you mess up, doing the next thing that you can, you know, and all these people are worse off at the end of the book than they were at the beginning. And I think after the book ends, you know, it's not going to be easy or nice. And sometimes I have a hard time imagining like how any of this can be resolved. But here are the cards they were dealt, and they're going to have to play them. You know, and I think that, you know, that impossibility of any given situation is something that I think about a lot. You know, I think about it, you know, now in terms of like, you know, when you lose a child, right? Like, I mean, and I've spoken with people who've lost children. I obviously, like, you know, we've lost people in our lives, and it's just thinking about the dailiness of, you know, you think it's impossible to continue to live after something horrible has happened, and yet people do it every day. And so I think I just wanted to kind of work with this idea that like everybody is in an impossible situation, and yet people who are in impossible situations still wake up. They still do what they can and what they have to do. And, you know, it's not narratively pretty, because you get to a place where, oh yeah, this is impossible. And so what does it look like? What is the impossible situation look like an hour later, you know, a day later, a month later? And so I think that's kind of what I wanted to force us to think about. You know, yeah, they everyone makes things worse, and yet they have to keep dealing with it. And I think that's just I don't know. I think that's the constant struggle that all of us have to deal with on some level.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. That was a great way of sort of wrapping up this really fascinating conversation. I before I sign off, I wanted to comment. Someone had just popped in the chat, the Q&A, from our special collections. Elena de Lemos in the library and special collections wanted to put in a plug for Oxy's incredible mystery and detective fiction collection. We have about 14,000 books, all in first edition, housed in special collections, several from Raymond Chandler with a handwritten dedications to the collector Ned Gaiman Oxy class of 1922. So you are, if reading this book has prompted more mystery, certainly feel free to make use of our wonderful collections in the library. So with that, I want to thank you again, Steph Cha, for sharing with us your creative process, your fascinating story, and your wonderful work of fiction. So thanks very much for bringing this to the Oxy community. Thank you, President Elam, for moderating a great conversation. I want to thank the Community Book Committee, Brian Chambers, Ron Buckmeyer, Carol Brickhouse, Vivian Santiago. I'm going to thank Allie Gordon in Office of Marketing and Communications for her help with logistics. And thanks to the entire Oxy community for joining us today.